I also want to say a little bit about foreign policy. I've already mentioned EU-US cooperation. I want to mention two other areas that I think are important. The first is what's called migration management in third countries. Now, in short, what the EU is doing is increasingly making aid and trade packages for North African countries contingent on these states accepting what are called migration management obligations. Now, these include readmission. So if the EU wants to expel someone, doesn't matter if they haven't got the right documents or it can't be ascertained where they come from, these countries will readmit them. Border controls, the introduction of asylum and immigration rules based on EU standards, and the establishment of detention centres, or what are more commonly referred to as transit centres. Colonel Gaddafi's celebrated reintegration into the international community was largely due to his willingness to build detention centres to house Ethiopians and Eritreans bound for Europe or being expelled from Europe. Now, again, I think wherever you stand on the immigration debate, like me, you might be not a little uncomfortable with the idea of African states being forced to introduce laws that criminalise illegal exit. You know, again, this is a policy that smacks of darker times. And the second foreign policy issue really is militarisation, and I'm not going to say much about that because there's people in this room I think who know more about it than I do, certainly Roger and Frank here. But basically in 1997 the EU was a purely civilian organisation with no military powers. Western European Union was incorporated into the EU legal order, and since then we've seen a fairly rapid development of a military apparatus in the EU. We're talking here about the Rapid Reaction Force that was initially conceived for peacekeeping duties, but this was then quickly expanded into the principle of EU battle groups. This is combat-ready troops. And we've also had the establishment of the European Defence Agency, which is going to deal with procurement issues. Now, this was agreed as part of the Constitution agreed in 2004, and the EU didn't even bother to wait until the legal basis had effectively been, legalised, and just went ahead and established the EDA. And from what seems to be happening is that the security research stuff is a bit of a precursor to a fairly long-held and increasingly naked ambition for the EU to have a full-on, military procurement role as well. And I think from about 2010, we're going to see quite significant moves in that direction. Now, of course, many people believe in so-called liberal interventionism. That the EU should be ready to intervene in places like Bosnia, Serbia, Kosovo, Macedonia, the Great Lakes of Africa, and the Middle East. And my own belief is that Iraq and Afghanistan have been an unmitigated disaster, but there may well be other places where some form of intervention is both necessary and desirable. What concerns me is that the EU doesn't seem to have much of a policy beyond police and military stabilisation. It's happy to send the troops in, but it's yet to really demonstrate a credible conflict resolution policy. And with the US threatening to intervene militarily in up to 40 states in the next 40 years or whatever their recent report said, my fear would be that the EU will end up embroiled in conflicts that it's very difficult to extricate itself from. Finally, the EU Constitution. There's a lot of debate about whether the Lisbon Treaty differs from the Reform Treaty from the Constitution. it's our belief that it's about 95% the same as the constitution that was rejected by French and Dutch voters. But I do have some sympathy with the argument that it is just another treaty, like Maastricht, Amsterdam, Nice before it. All it really does is extends the parameters for cooperation and amends the rules for putting that cooperation into practice. Of course, this means it represents a further transfer of powers from nation state to EU, but in the area in which we do most of our work, justice, home affairs and security, it is important to point out that the Reform Treaty will have some probably positive effects. I'm talking here about wider freedom of information, a greater role for the European Parliament, a wider jurisdiction for the European Court of Justice, EU accession to the European Convention on Human Rights, and the incorporation of the Charter on Fundamental Rights. But for all of that, there's no doubt in my mind that it's just another significant step in the path towards the creation of the kind of EU state apparatus that I've been describing. And for that reason alone, if I had a vote on the EU constitution, I would certainly vote against it. I guess to conclude, most of the debate is about sort of, where is Europe going, what should its role be. I'd really like to see some kind of debate about where does Europe stop. I really think that having achieved many of the things that, the EU can be rightly proud of, we really need to talk about what are the limits to where the EU is going, and why are those limits necessary and desirable. And I'll stop there. Thanks very much.